I'm going to show you how to make this beautiful and delicious artisan bread with a 3-hour cold ferment. This is going to be the shortest cold fermentation recipe you've ever seen. This bread is absolutely fantastic. It's airy, it's soft, and it's crispy on the outside. Let's get into it. Hey, Seraphin here, and we'll be making a soft artisan bread with a short cold fermentation. In our previous video, we dove deep into the science of cold fermentation and highlighted how it's often limited by a common misunderstanding, that only a prolonged fermentation yields significant results. In my opinion, this belief has kept people from using cold fermentation in more flexible ways. You'll find very few resources recommending a short cold fermentation despite its scientifically proven benefits. This means many bakers either dismiss the technique outright or they simply don't know a more flexible, time-saving option exists. Previously, our focus was on the why of cold fermentation. Today, we're all about the how, a hands-on guide to short cold fermentation with an easy recipe. You might remember me saying that this method was pretty revolutionary for me. You see, I used to have a very set routine for making my bread dough. First, I'd make a pre-ferment and let it sit on the kitchen table for about an hour before cold fermenting it in the fridge overnight. By the time the pre-ferment was at its peak, it would be cold, bubbly, full of flavor, and packed with leavening power. I'd then incorporate it directly into my final dough and let it ferment at room temperature through its bulk and proofing stages before baking. That routine was my guarantee for a perfect loaf every time. If that routine was my guarantee for a perfect loaf, you might wonder why I'd ever change it. To be clear, I'm not abandoning my old method. Those loaves are fantastic, and I'll still bake them when I want more intense flavors. But now there's a new option for making great bread, especially for those who prefer softer, slightly fruitier flavors with a much shorter cold fermentation period. Here's the process in simple terms. First, mix your dough with or without a pre-ferment, adding more yeast if necessary. Then give the dough around 2 hours of cold bulk fermentation at 5 degrees Celsius. After that, we shape the dough and proof it in the fridge for another hour to let the dough rise before baking. Voila, a perfectly baked and flavorful bread. Simple, isn't it? But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's quickly recap how cold fermentation works and cover some important points. In essence, cold fermenting your dough at around 5 degrees Celsius gives you a loaf with fewer off flavors from a process called lipid oxidation, and the cold temperatures also increase the amount of certain positive aromas. In the case of sourdough, cold fermentation can result in a more sour loaf with more complex flavors. Low fermentation temperatures for sourdough could also affect microbial dynamics, but this is often more applicable to how you ferment your starter rather than the final bread dough. Now, in the comments of my last video, 2 points kept coming up that I want to address as they're central to this technique. First, a quick clarification about fats and flavor. I mentioned that cold fermentation prevents off flavors from lipid oxidation. Some people commented that this wouldn't apply to them because they didn't add fats like butter or oil to their lean dough. But the truth is, lipids are naturally present in wheat flour. These endogenous lipids react with oxygen, a process often accelerated by enzymes like lipoxygenase that are also present in the flour. Cold temperatures, however, significantly slow down these chemical and enzymatic reactions. By fermenting the dough in a cold environment, like your refrigerator, you inhibit the enzymes responsible for lipid oxidation. This means the process happens regardless of added fat, so the flavor benefits of cold fermentation apply to virtually all bread and pizza doughs. Second, and this was the big one, was the debate around adding more yeast. Some bakers loved the idea, others were horrified. Let me address this because it's key to our short fermentation. From our last video, we learned that the levels of most lipid oxidation products are independent of yeast concentration. This means increasing the yeast within the recommended range shouldn't have a serious impact on lipid oxidation products. However, there's a crucial aspect that's often overlooked. Not all commercial baker's yeast is created equal. The brand you use can heavily influence your bread's flavor. One study found that different yeast brands produced significant differences in aroma. Some even resulted in more byproducts of lipid oxidation, potentially creating more off flavors. So if you dislike bread made with more yeast, consider trying a different brand. I can personally vouch for this. Switching from a generic yeast to a quality brand made a night and day difference in my baking. Furthermore, while many people believe less yeast means more flavor, the science isn't so clear-cut. Yeast creates many of the positive aroma compounds that we love. One study compared a traditional baguette process with more yeast to an industrial one with less yeast and a longer fermentation period. A sensory panel still preferred the traditional baguettes, indicating that the process itself was more important than the yeast quantity. Additionally, remember, with fermentation, timing is crucial. We are using a larger amount of yeast here specifically to speed up fermentation in a very cold environment, the fridge. We aren't just randomly adding more yeast. We are balancing time, temperature, and yeast quantity to achieve a specific result. All right, since we know all this, how should we approach a short cold fermentation for our bread dough? Well, one paper on cold fermentation recommended fermenting the dough at 5 degrees Celsius using around 6% fresh yeast, baker's percentage, which is roughly equivalent to 2 to 3% instant yeast, depending on the strain. According to the study, a dough with this much yeast took around 3 hours at 5 degrees Celsius to rise properly. While these percentages might seem high compared to many home recipes, they fall within established industry guidelines. For example, a major yeast company recommends using anywhere from 1 to 3% instant yeast. So the paper's 6% fresh yeast figure, which is about 2 to 3% instant yeast, lands squarely at the high end of the typical range. As a big fan of using pre-ferments, I know these numbers can seem like a lot. In most of my recipes with a Poolish, for example, I only use 0.2 to 0.3% instant yeast, obviously not 2 to 3%. At a glance, the paper's recommendation is 10 times the amount I typically use, so an explanation is definitely needed. When I make a Poolish, I usually use 20 to 30% of the total flour for the pre-ferment. The amount of instant yeast I add is about 1% based on the flour in the Poolish, which calculates to 0.2% or 0.3% of the total flour in the recipe. But by letting the Poolish ferment for 3 to 4 hours at room temperature, I get a very active starter packed with leavening power. Yeast grows rapidly in such a nutrient-rich environment, with a doubling time of about 80 to 90 minutes. Assuming this growth rate, the yeast population at its peak becomes equivalent to 0.8 to 1.2% of the total flour in the recipe. So getting to the paper's recommendation of 2 to 3%, roughly 2 to 3 times the final yeast population in my pre-ferment, is still quite reasonable. That being said, in this specific recipe, we won't be following the paper exactly. After all, this is a home baker's recipe. Our kitchens aren't laboratories with perfectly controlled conditions, so we need to adjust their findings to fit our reality. Additionally, we're extending the fermentation period overall to improve flavor and achieve a better crumb, which means using less yeast overall. This all falls into the art of baking. There are many ways to approach this while still respecting the science. So for this recipe, we're still going to use a pre-ferment, and you might be wondering how exactly this method differs from my previous pre-ferment routine. Well, my old routine for a Poolish involved a 1-hour fermentation at room temperature, followed by an overnight cold ferment in the fridge. The goal was to develop flavor while the yeast slowly multiplied. In this new routine, we'll let the pre-ferment ferment entirely at room temperature, around 27 to 29 degrees Celsius in my kitchen, until it peaks, which usually takes 3 to 4 hours. And we've done this to shorten the overall fermentation time while still retaining some flavor. Although the overall flavor profile will be slightly different, which I find to be a little better and softer. Now, to ensure the short cold bulk fermentation, we have to add about an extra 1% of instant yeast in the final dough to go along with the leavening power of the pre-ferment, which, as we mentioned earlier, was estimated to be around 1% at its peak. So overall, we have 2% of instant yeast as recommended by the paper. Do note that due to factors like your room temperature and yeast condition, you might need to experiment a little to get a perfect grasp of your dough. Fridge temperatures also vary, so that may influence the timing. One simple trick I used with my old fridge was to put a bowl of ice cubes beside my dough to help it quickly achieve the ideal 3 to 5 degree temperature range. It was quite effective. In case you're facing the same issues with your fridge, you may want to try it. Of course, you can find your own convenient way to get the right temperature. But remember, especially if you have a packed fridge, it may take hours for the dough to cool down to 5 degrees Celsius. The long cool down period can effectively negate the benefits of a short cold fermentation, so do take care. With all that said, let's get into the recipe. This is the bread we're making. Just look at that beautiful ear. This bread has a very fluffy texture and a soft crumb, offering a perfect blend of airiness and rich flavor. The crunchy crust pairs wonderfully with the soft crumb, making it truly addictive to eat. The recipe itself is also super simple, without any complicated steps. Of course, though, with any recipe, note that you may need to adjust the timing and the amount of yeast to suit your environment. If you live in a warmer climate or your fridge isn't very cold, you may need to lower the amount of yeast and/or ferment for a shorter period of time. Conversely, you might increase both the yeast and fermentation time if you live in a colder climate. Keep in mind that the activity of your yeast and your room temperature can also greatly affect the dough. Although we roughly calculated the amount of yeast that should be in the poolish after it ferments, the actual number could vary depending on your yeast condition and aforementioned room temperature. This is another factor that can greatly affect your dough, so make sure to keep an eye on it and adjust as needed. In this recipe, we'll also be using the Tangzhong method. Tangzhong makes the crumb incredibly soft and helps the bread stay fresh for longer. I've subjectively tested this myself. I cut the loaf open, left it on the counter for a full day, and it was still soft and tender. Your results may vary depending on your relative humidity, but this bread will definitely stay tender for longer than most breads. We will also be using ice water to mix the dough, which has been shown to improve the loaf's volume and texture. If you live in a cold climate, you might not need ice, but you should still aim for water that is significantly colder than your flour. As one study showed, this temperature difference helps develop a stronger gluten network. Okay, our first step now is to make the Tangzhong and Poolish. We start with making the Poolish. We have all the ingredients prepared, and we are adding the flour to the bowl first. Then following it is the instant yeast. Giving it a quick mix with the chopsticks. Then we pour in all of the water. Continue mixing until everything is well combined. Because of the high hydration, this Poolish shouldn't take too long to mix together. After that, clean off the chopsticks, tapping the sticky bits of Poolish back into the bowl before covering it well. We're going to leave this out to ferment until it reaches its peak and starts to come down slightly. You could also put it into the fridge if you'd like to make the bread tomorrow or build more flavor. And when we're done with the Poolish, we're going to make the Tangzhong. Prepare a bowl on top of a scale, then pour in the boiling hot water, measuring it out. Then immediately after that, toss in the flour. Mix this with a spatula until it's well combined. The most important step in making Tangzhong is making sure there's enough heat and water for the starch in the flour to gelatinize. So we want to make sure to add in the flour while the water is as hot as possible. I turn everything over a few times just to ensure that there's no dry flour. Then once it looks like this, we're done. So we cover the bowl and let this cool to room temperature. At this point, I like to put the Tangzhong in the fridge while the Poolish ferments so that it can cool down more quickly. This can also help us achieve a lower dough temperature. After around 3 to 4 hours, the Poolish is ready and we can start making the final dough. Prepare a large mixing bowl and all the ingredients. This recipe is done entirely by hand, so you don't need a mixer. First off, we're using ice water here to keep the dough temperature low from the very beginning, measuring it using a scale. Since our climate is very warm, we try to use extremely cold water. You may need to adjust this for your environment. Then we toss in the salt. And we want to add all the tangzhong into the mixing bowl with a spatula. We'll break up the tangzhong into the water. This step is super simple but super important, so make sure to take a bit of time here. When it looks like this, we're going to uncover the Poolish and scrape it into the bowl. Mix everything together with the spatula. And when it's roughly combined, add the extra yeast and all of the flour into the mix. Again, this is where you can very easily adjust the amount of yeast you want to add based on how long you want to ferment the dough for. After adding everything in, we combine all the ingredients together. After a while, we're going to switch to using our hands to mix the dough. This kneading motion here is mainly done to mix the ingredients together. The gluten proteins haven't been fully hydrated, so we're just trying to get everything combined. Once the dough looks like this, a still pretty undeveloped but well-mixed dough, we stop our motions and clean the sides of the bowl. Next, we cover it and immediately place the bread dough in the fridge. We'll be starting our cold ferment right away. We'll leave the dough to rest in the fridge for 30 minutes. Then we take it out for the first round of stretch and folds. Prepare a bowl of water by the side to dip your hands into to prevent sticking. For this first round, we're going to do 8 stretch and folds. Pull one side of the dough up and stretch it over itself, then rotate the bowl slightly and repeat, going all the way around the dough for a total of 8 times. This builds serious strength in the dough, and you should be able to feel it. The second set of 4 stretch and folds will likely be a lot tighter, which is perfectly fine. We cover the bowl again and place it back into the fridge. Let it rest for another 30 minutes. After that time has passed, we take the dough out again. This time we'll do another round of 4 stretch and folds going around all 4 sides. You should notice that the dough is more taut and much stronger than before. Immediately after those 4 folds, we're going to flip the dough over and somewhat round it into a boule, using gentle movements to gently stretch the dough and kind of pre-shape it a bit, allowing it to become more uniform and build a little more strength. When that's done, we should see a smooth upper surface and we can stop rounding the dough. Cover the bowl, and we will now let the dough rest for another hour in the fridge. This last period of rest brings our total cold fermentation time to 2 hours at this point. When that time is up, we uncover the bowl and then lightly sprinkle some bread flour onto the dough, as well as onto the work surface to prevent sticking. We then take out the dough using a scraper to help detach any sticky bits. Now it's time to shape it. We're going to shape it into a longer oval-shaped loaf called a Batard. So we need to take the dough and gently fold the bottom half up, then pull in the sides like this, before folding in the top. Here we'll stitch the sides in this way. It's a bit like a cross stitch. After which we tighten everything by rolling it up. Now, my banneton is quite long, so I like to lengthen the dough a little bit, rocking it back and forth until it's as long as I need it to be. I also take the time to degas most of the large bubbles I see on the surface, and I seal the ends of the dough as well. If the dough is too stiff at this point, then you could just give it a 5 to 10 minute bench rest before coming back to shape it. Once our loaf is shaped, we're going to place it into the banneton to rise before baking. We'll line the banneton with just a bit of rice flour, then we put the dough in. Doing some final stitching to make sure it's nice and tight. And now we cover the dough and take it back to the fridge where it's going to proof for another hour. While the dough rises, we take the time to preheat the oven to 240 degrees Celsius. And since we're using a Dutch oven as well, we're going to be preheating it too. Then when the dough is ready and the oven is properly preheated, we take out the dough. Flip it out of the banneton gently onto the parchment paper. We're going to easily score it one smooth long cut and then go back in at a flatter angle to make sure it forms an ear. Then we place it into the Dutch oven along with a small ice cube before covering it and putting it into the oven. We let it bake for 20 minutes at 230 degrees Celsius, top and bottom heat, covered. Then we uncover the Dutch oven and bake for another 10 to 15 minutes at around 200 degrees Celsius with the fan on or until the bread becomes a beautiful shade of golden brown all over. You may need to adjust these settings to your oven. And we are done. Flavor-wise, cold fermentation is particularly good for softer, sweeter bread styles, bringing a rich, aromatic crumb. The Tangzhong makes it perfectly soft and it stays that way for longer. Overall, even if you don't try this recipe, I hope we've opened up new possibilities for using cold fermentation in your bread doughs, creating fun, new recipes that perfectly suit your preferences. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching and bye!